Tale of Magic. Chapter 2, A Sign. That day at the Chariot Hills School for Future Wives and Mothers, Bristol learned the proper amount of tea to serve to an unexpected visitor, the type of appetizers to cook for formal gatherings, and how to fold a napkin into the shape of a dove. Among their riveting subjects, toward the end of class, Bristol had rolled her eyes so many times her eye sockets were sore. Usually, she was better at hiding her annoyance during school hours, but without the comfort of a good book waiting for her at home, it was much more difficult to conceal her irritation. To soothe her aggravation, Bristol thought about the last page she had read in the Tales of Tibbet Twitch before falling asleep the night before. The story's hero, a field mouse named Tidbit, was hanging off a cliff while battling a ferocious dragon. His tiny claws were getting tired as he swung from ledge to ledge to dodge the monster's scourging breath. With his last bit of strength, he threw his small sword at the dragon, hoping it would wound the beast and give him a chance to climb to safety. Miss Evergreen? By some miracle, Tidbit's sword flew through the air and pierced the dragon's eye. The creature jerked its head toward the heavens and howled in pain, sending fiery geysers through the night sky. As Tidbit crawled down the side of the cliff, the dragon whipped its pointed tail and knocked the mouse off the boulder he clung to. Tidbit fell toward the rocky earth below, limbs flailing around as he reached for something, anything to grab onto. Miss Evergreen! Bristol sat straight up in her seat like she had been pricked with an invisible pin. All her classmates turned toward her desk in the back row and stared at her with matching frowns. Their teacher, Mrs. Plume, glared at her from the front of the classroom with pursed lips and one of her penciled eyebrows raised. Yes? Bristol asked with large, innocent eyes. Miss Evergreen, are you paying attention or are you daydreaming again? Mrs. Plume asked. I'm paying attention, of course, she lied. Then what is the appropriate way to handle the situation I just described? The teacher challenged. Obviously, Bristol didn't have a clue what the class was discussing. The other girls giggled in anticipation of a good chastising. Fortunately, Bristol knew an answer that solved all of Mrs. Plume's questions, no matter what topic it was. I suppose I would ask my future husband what to do, she replied. Mrs. Plume stared at Bristol for a few moments without blinking. That's correct, the teacher was surprised to admit. Bristol sighed with relief, and her classmates sighed with disappointment. They had always looked forward to moments when Bristol was reprimanded for her infamous daydreaming. Even Mrs. Plume seemed disappointed at a missed opportunity to scold her. The teacher would have slumped if her tight corset allowed it. Moving on, Mrs. Plume instructed, we'll now review the difference between tying hair ribbons and shoelaces and the dangers of mixing them up. The students cheered for their next lesson, and their enthusiasm made Bristol die a little on the inside. She knew she couldn't be the only girl at school who wanted a more exciting life than what they were being prepared for, but as she watched her classmates strain their necks to see ribbons and shoelaces, she couldn't tell if they were all phenomenal actors or just phenomenally brainwashed. Bristol knew better than to mention her dreams or frustrations to anyone, But she didn't have to say anything for people to know she was different. Like wolves from an opposing pack, the whole school could practically smell it on her. And since the Southern Kingdom was a scary place for people who thought differently, Bristol's classmates kept their distance from her, as if difference was a contagious disease. Don't worry, one day they'll regret this, Bristol thought. One day they'll wish they were nice to me. One day I'll be celebrated for my differences. One day they'll be the unhappy ones, not me. To avoid any more unwanted attention, Bristol remained as quiet and alert as possible until the end of class. The only time she moved a muscle was to lightly caress the reading glasses hidden in her dress. That afternoon, Bristol walked home from school at a slower pace than usual. With nothing but chores waiting for her, she decided to stroll through the Chariot Hills town square, hoping the change of scenery would take her mind off her troubles. The Champion Castle, the cathedral and courthouse, and the University of Law each towered over the four sides of the town square. Busy shops and markets filled the corners and spaces between the authoritative structures. In the center of the town square was a grassy patch where a statue of King Champion I stood above a shallow fountain. The statue depicted the sovereign on horseback as he pointed a sword into a seemingly prosperous future. But the tribute received more attention from pigeons than from the citizens wandering through town. As Bristol walked past the University of Law, she gazed up at its stone walls and its impressive glass domes with envy. At that very moment, she knew Barry was somewhere inside, agonizing over his examination. Bristol could have sworn she felt her brother's anxiety radiating through the walls. But still, she would have given anything to trade places with him. She stopped to say a prayer for him before moving on. Bristol had no choice but to pass the courthouse as she continued through the town square. It was an ominous building with tall pillars and a triangular roof. Each pillar had the image of a high justice carved into it, and the carvings scowled down at the citizens on the ground like disapproving parents, an expression Bristol knew well. She couldn't stop a wave of anger from flooding her stomach as she eyed the intimidating faces above her. Men like them, men like her father, were the reason she had such little happiness. In the corner of the town square, between the university and courthouse, was the Chariot Hills Library. It was a small and modest structure compared to the buildings surrounding it, but to Bristol, the library could have been a palace. A black plaque with a red triangle was displayed above its double doors, a common symbol in the Southern Kingdom that reminded women they weren't allowed to enter. But the law did nothing to diminish Bristol's desire to go in. Being so close to many books and being forbidden to enjoy them gave Bristol a terrible feeling whenever she laid eyes on the library. But today the sensation was unbearable. The helplessness she felt triggered her avalanche of emotions, and all the fear, doubt, and heartbreak she had been suppressing trampled over her like a stampede. The scenic route home was creating the opposite effect of what she had intended. The town square suddenly felt like a cage closing in on her. Bristol was so overwhelmed she could barely breathe. She shooed a cluster of pigeons away from the champion statue and had a seat on the edge of the fountain to catch her breath. I can't do this anymore, she panted. I keep telling myself that things will get better, but they will only get worse and worse. If life is just a series of disappointments, then I wish I'd never been born. I wish I could turn into a cloud and float far, far, far away from here. Tears spilled down her face before she knew they were coming. A few townspeople noticed the emotional scene and paused to gawk at her. But Bristol couldn't care less. She buried her face in the palms of her hands and wept in front of everyone. God, I need more than just faith to keep going, she cried. I need proof that I'm not as foolish as I feel. I need a message that life won't always be so miserable. Please, I need a sign. Ironically, after Bristol finished crying and had dried her tears, a sign was the first thing she saw. An old and rickety librarian emerged from the library with a bright yellow board under his arm. With shaky hands, he pinned the board on the library's entranceway. Bristol had never seen a sign posted outside the library before and was very curious. Once the librarian returned inside, she hurried to the front steps to read the words painted across the board. Maid wanted. Suddenly an idea came to Bristol that sent tingles through her entire body. Before she could second-guess herself, and before she was even fully aware of what she was doing, Bristol pushed through the front doors and entered the Chariot Hills Library. Her first glimpse of the library was so overstimulating. It took a few moments for Bristol's mind to catch up with her eyes. In all the years she had spent wondering what the library looked like inside, she never imagined it could be so magnificent. It was an enormous circular room with an emerald carpet. The walls were covered in wooden paneling, and natural light flowed in from a glass ceiling. A massive silver globe stood in the center of the first floor, and dozens of law students were spread out at antique tables and armchairs around it. But most amazing of all, the library was surrounded by 3 stories of bookshelves that stretched into the upper floors like a multi-level maze. The sight of thousands and thousands of books made Bristol lightheaded, like she had just stepped into a dream. She never knew so many books existed in the whole world, let alone in her local library. Bristol spotted the elderly librarian standing behind a counter at the front of the room. Her impromptu plan would end in disaster. Her important plan would end in disaster if she didn't play her cards right. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, wished herself luck, and approached him. "Excuse me, sir," Bristol asked. The librarian was busy applying labels to a fresh stack of books and didn't notice her right away. Bristol instantly felt a spark of jealousy toward the old man. She could only imagine how many books he had touched and read over the years. "Excuse me, Mr. Woolsworth?" she asked after reading the nameplate on the countertop. The librarian squinted at her and reached for a pair of thick spectacles nearby. Once his glasses were on, the old man's jaw dropped. He pointed at Bristol like a wild animal was loose in the building. "Young lady, what are you doing here?" Mr. Woodnor exclaimed. "Women aren't allowed in the library. Now get out before I call the authorities." "Actually, it's perfectly legal for me to be inside," Bristol explained, hoping her tranquil tone would mellow his. "You see, according to the Hired Help Act of 417, women are allowed to enter male-only premises to seek employment. By posting the sign outside, you're giving me the legal right to enter the building and apply for the position." Bristol knew the Hired Help Act of 417 only applied to women older than 20, but she was hoping the librarian wasn't as familiar with the law as she was. Mr. Woolsworth scrunched his fuzzy eyebrows and watched her like a hawk. "You want to be a maid?" he asked. "Yes," Bristol said with a shrug. It's honest work, is it not? But shouldn't a girl your age be busy learning how to curtsy and flirt with boys? Mr. Woolsor asked. Bristol was compelled to argue, but she swallowed her pride and kept her eye on the prize. To be honest, Mr. Woolsor, she said, a boy is exactly why I want the position. You see, there's this deputy justice I'm just smitten with. I desperately want him to propose to me one day, but I don't think he sees me as wife material. My family has servants, many servants, so he has no reason to believe I'm capable of household chores. But when he finds out I've been cleaning the library all by myself, to perfection, I might add, he'll know I'll make him a better wife than all the other girls in town. Bristol even twirled her hair and blinked her eyes helplessly like a deer to sell the performance. I sympathize, but you aren't practical candidate for the position, the librarian said. I can't have you in the library while law students are studying. A young girl would be too much of a distraction for young men. Then perhaps I could clean in the evening after the library closes, Bristol suggested. Most establishments have their maids clean after hours. I could start as soon as you leave, and it would be spotless when you return the next morning. Mr. Woolsor crossed his arms and eyed her suspiciously. She was almost too convincing to be trusted. This isn't some scheme, is it? He inquired. You aren't applying for the job so you can be around books, are you? Bristol felt her heart plunge into her gut. The librarian was seeing through her dishonesty as easily as her mother would, but instead of letting the panic surface on her face, Bristol laughed at the idea and tried using his ignorance against him. Mr. Woolsor, I'm a 14-year-old girl. What interest would I have in books? According to the librarian's body language, reverse psychology did the trick. Mr. Woolsor chuckled to himself as if he was foolish for thinking it in the first place. Bristol knew she was close to persuading him. She just needed to offer him one more perk to sweeten the deal. How much does the position pay, sir? She asked. 6 gold coins a week, he said. The position is 5 days a week. Employees don't work weekends or the royal holidays, Kingsgiving and Champions Eve. I'll tell you what, Mr. Woolsor, since you'll be doing me a favor, I'll do you a favor too. If you hire me to clean the library, I'll do it for 3 gold coins a week. Her offer was music to Mr. Woolsor's ears. He scratched his chin and nodded as it became more and more appealing to him. What's your name, young lady? She asked. It's Bristol. Luckily, Bristol stopped herself before revealing her family name. If the librarian knew she was an evergreen, her father might find out she had applied for the job, and that was a risk she couldn't take. So, Bristol gave him the first name that came to mind, and her allies was born. My name is Bailey. Bristol Eve Bailey. Well, all right then, Miss Bailey, Mr. Woolsor said. If you can start tomorrow evening, you're hired. Bristol couldn't contain her excitement. Her whole body began to vibrate like she was being tickled from the inside out. She reached across the counter and vigorously shook the librarian's frail hand. Thank you, Mr. Woolsor. Thank you so much. I promise I won't let you down. Oh, pardon my grip. Hope that didn't hurt. See you tomorrow. Bristol practically floated out of the library and down the road to the eastern countryside. Her plan was more successful than she could have ever predicted. In just one day, she would have access to thousands and thousands of books, and with no one in the library to supervise her, Bristol could easily sneak a few home each night after she was finished cleaning. The prospect was exhilarating, and Bristol couldn't remember the last time she had felt so much happiness coursing through her veins. However, Bristol's euphoria came to a screeching halt as soon as the evergreen house appeared on the horizon. For the first time, she realized how impractical the situation was. There wasn't a feasible way she could work evenings at the library without her family noticing absence. She would need to give them a reason why she was leaving the house at night and staying out so late. If she wanted to work at the library, Bristol would have to create a spectacular lie that not only gained her family's approval, but also avoided any suspicion whatsoever. If she was caught, the consequences would be catastrophic. Bristol clenched her jaw as she thought about the daunting challenge ahead. Apparently, getting a job at the library was only her first impossible task of the day. Later that night, the Evergreen house was buzzing with celebration. A messenger had arrived from the University of Law with the news that Barry had passed his examination with the highest marks in his class. Bristol and Mrs. Evergreen cooked up a feast to commemorate Barry's victory, including a chocolate cake Bristol made from scratch. By the time the Evergreens sat down to eat, Barry was already wearing his new Deputy Justice robes. "How do I look?" he asked everyone at the table. "Like a child wearing a man's clothes," Brooks quipped. "No, you look perfect," Bristol said. "Like you were born for it." Bristol was so proud of her brother, but also especially grateful for an excuse to look so cheerful. Whenever she thought her new job at the library, no one questioned the smile that beamed across her face. Everyone in her family shared the same excitement. Even Brooks' bitterness softened after a few glasses of sparkling cider. "I can't believe my little boy is going to be a deputy justice," Mrs. Evergreen said through happy tears. "It feels like only yesterday you were wearing my long shirts and sentencing your toys to hard labor in the backyard. My, how times fly." "I'm so proud of you, son," Justice Evergreen said. "You're keeping the family legacy alive and well." "Thank you, Father," Barry said. "Do you have any advice for my first week at the courthouse?" "You'll only be observing cases for your first month, but pay attention to every detail of the proceedings," the justice advised. "After that, you'll be assigned your first prosecution. No matter what the charges are, you must recommend the maximum penalty. Otherwise, the sitting justice will think you're weak and will likely side with the defense. Now, when you're assigned your first defense, the secret to—" Justice Evergreen went quiet as his eyes fell on Bristol. He had almost forgotten she was in the room. "On second thought, perhaps we should continue this at a later time," he said. "I would hate for our conversation to be absorbed by prying ears." The justice's comments made Bristol go tense, but not because her father's words offended her. After a long afternoon of plotting, Bristol was waiting for the perfect moment to secure her future at the library, and this might be the only chance. "Father, may I say something?" she asked. Justice Evergreen grunted like it was a chore to give his daughter any attention. The other Evergreens looked back and forth at Bristol and the justice with nervous eyes, fearing dinner would end on the same note as breakfast had. "Yes, what is it?" the justice asked. "Well, I've been thinking a lot about you said this morning," Bristol began. "I don't want to be disrespectful to the law, so perhaps you were right when you suggested I eat meals elsewhere." "Oh," her father said. "Yes, and I believe I've found the perfect solution," Bristol continued. "Today after school, I stopped by the Chariot Hills Home for the Hopeless. They're desperately understaffed, so with your blessing, I would like to start volunteering there evenings after school." You want to catch fleas at a poorhouse? Brooks asked in disbelief. Mrs. Evergreen held out a hand to silence her eldest son. Thanks you, Brooks. But your father and I will handle this, she said. Bristol, it's very kind that you want to help the less fortunate, but I need your help in this house. I can't manage all the chores and cooking dinner on my own. Bristol lowered her head and looked at her hands so Mrs. Evergreen wouldn't detect any dishonesty in her eyes. But I'm not abandoning you, Mother, she explained. After school, I'll come home and help you cook and clean, just like always. And when it's time for dinner, I'll simply slip away for a few hours to volunteer at the Home for the Hopeless. At night, I'll return home and do the dishes before bed. Just like always. I may lose an hour or two of sleep, but it shouldn't affect anything else. The dining room went quiet as Justice Evergreen considered his daughter's request. Bristol felt like an invisible weight was tied around her stomach, and with every passing moment, it became heavier and heavier. The 30 seconds it took to get an answer seemed like hours. I agree. A change is needed to prevent other incidents, like the one this morning, her father said. You may volunteer evenings at the Home for the Hopeless, but only if it doesn't create extra hard work for your mother. Justice Evergreen banged the table with his fork like it was a gavel, cementing his final ruling of the day. Bristol couldn't believe she had pulled it off. Working at a library was now a reality. The weight around her stomach was suddenly released, and Bristol knew she had to get out of her family's sight before she started bouncing off the walls. Thank you so much, Father, she said. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'll give you and Barry some privacy so you can speak freely about the courthouse. I'll come back to clear the table when you finish dessert. Bristol was excused from the dinner table and hurried upstairs to her bedroom. Once the door was closed behind her, Bristol danced around her room as energetically as she could without making a sound. As she twirled past her mirror, Bristol saw something she hadn't seen since she was a small child. Instead of a depressed and defeated girl in a silly school uniform, she was facing a happy and vibrant young woman with hopeful eyes and rosy cheeks. It was like she was looking at a different person altogether. You're a bad girl, Bristol Bailey, she whispered to her reflection. A very, very bad girl.